Hello and welcome back. Today we're going to be doing something I actually don't think I've ever really done on my channel. I know back, I'm talking 5 or 6 years ago, I used to be semi-active on Bookstagram, but I don't ever think I brought it into YouTube. But when I suggested in my welcome back video that I start doing a bit more booky kind of content, people seem to really be down for that. So this is the first installment of that, with a list and sort of discussion on the best and worst books I read in 2020. Before I get into the books, it's time for Mug of the Day. So today's Mug of the Day actually does have tea in it. We've got liquid. I don't know if you can see the steam coming out, but this is one of my favourite mugs. I completely thought existed until I refound it the other day. It's a black cat mug called Albus Dumblepaw in honour of my old cat Albus, who sadly passed away about a year ago. I love this mug, reminds me of him, and he was the goodest cat in the world. So without further ado, let's get on to our best and worst books of 2020. I really didn't read that much last year, which is probably surprising given the fact that we were sort of in a pandemic and there was plenty of time to read and really not many excuses not to. I think I touched on this in my welcome back video. I found it really difficult to focus on anything and to really channel much productivity. I ended up doing it in other ways, like with my sewing business and stuff like that. And I feel like as well, a problem I've been combating recently and even now, reading to me feels like a luxury I don't have time for. I found myself listening to a lot of audiobooks, and I've really fallen in love with audiobooks because I can listen to a book while I do other things, while I clean, while I sew, while I knit, while I crochet. And I don't know if it's just I really have lost my ability to focus on things, but sitting down and reading and only doing one thing at once is just completely inconceivable to my brain at the moment. I find the same thing with sitting down and watching TV or films. I watched the entirety of Breaking Bad last year with my partner because he just absolutely loves it. Even while I was watching Breaking Bad, which was completely compelling and wonderful and one of the best TV shows I've ever watched, I was knitting while I was doing it because I just couldn't fathom the idea of just doing one thing at once and not having multiple things happening, or not using my hands while I was consuming another form of media. I'm trying to bring back designating time for myself to sit and read a book. Nothing wrong with audiobooks. In fact, I'm a big champion of audiobooks because they definitely still count as reading, and I don't understand people that don't count them as reading. But for relaxation purposes, I think it's important to spend time and just do one thing. Without further ado, I'm just going to go through, I'm going to start with the worst books and then finish on the best books so I can end on a positive note. Like I said, didn't read that much last year, so what you see here is sort of the best and worst, and there was a few books in between that I also read, but honestly I wasn't really keeping track. This year I've decided to restart my Goodreads challenge, which I didn't do last year. I've set myself the task of 30 books, I think, although I'm actually already on to book 4 of the year, and that's simply because I've been making a bit more time to read, and also I have been listening to audiobooks as well. It's a really great way to keep track of what you've read, because if you're anything like me, you'll read a book and then give it a month, you'll have forgotten you read it and you don't remember anything about it. That's how my brain works. Don't feel bad if that's how your brain works too. There's a lot of content to consume, and when our minds are constantly in a state of turmoil because of the state of the world, why would you remember the details of chapter 17 in a book you read 2 months ago? I know I don't. Let's get into the worst books. I've stacked them all up next to me, but I haven't separated them out, so I'm just going to quickly do that. So I said this is going to be a best and worst. However, some of the books in my worst category, they fall somewhere in my middle category. I've just wanted to include them because I think they were interesting to talk about. I'm going to start on the furthest end of the spectrum with a book I really did not enjoy and was very much a struggle to finish, and that was Ready Player 2 by Ernest Cline. Now, I loved Ready Player 1 when that came out quite a few years ago now. I consumed the book so quickly and I was really into it, and then when the film came out, I thought the film adaptation was actually a really strong adaptation. It was changed in the right places to make sense on screen, and I just feel like it was very faithful to the book. The main things I liked about Ready Player 1 was that although I don't have a vast knowledge of 80s pop culture and of video games, I knew enough to follow things without it detracting from the story, and anything I did know and pick up on was really thrilling. It was lovely to see Easter eggs and everything that was all embedded in the book in a way that I felt like maybe people that had a wider knowledge may have enjoyed the book more than I did, because there was a lot more to get out of it, but I was still able to enjoy the book in a way that felt like I wasn't being excluded. Unfortunately, the same can't be said for Ready Player 2. Now, I didn't even realise a sequel had come out. I've been so away from the book world and of understanding and hearing about new releases. I didn't even realise it was coming out until I saw Waterstones post that it was release day, and I was like, oh damn, okay, I better order that. So I ordered it, it arrived, and I was very excited. Immediately, a few chapters into the book, I was like, what's going on? Because it felt like the first few chapters could have been the sequel. I felt like they just rushed straight through this story to get to the point where I could tell Ernest Cline wanted to write from. And so it felt like he had this idea in his head of what he wants the sequel to be, but in order to get to that point, he had to fill in this middle gap. And that made this whole entrance to the book feel so rushed. I feel like I couldn't keep up with what was going on or properly sort of conceptualise or understand it in my head. It's been a while since I read Ready Player 1. I'm a big fan of rereading books, and and I think I've read Ready Player One more than once, but it's been a while since I've been acquainted with these characters, and to be thrown straight in and suddenly be having to try and keep up with all of these people and understand where they've all gone in their lives and go through, and a year passes or something crazy like that within the first few chapters, where you're going, I felt exhausted. I was like, mentally, the gymnastics I'm having to do to keep up with what's happening felt tiring, and it sort of took the enjoyment out. Then when the story sort of, you got to the point where you knew that Ernest Cline was really wanting to start his story and start the next action, like this is what's going to happen, we're now at the new beginning and we're going to head to the new middle and we're going to head to the new end. I was lost, to be honest.
Hi, so it's Editing Laura here. I just want to preface this next bit by saying that, talk a bit about how the book felt a bit exclusionary and stuff. And I just want to say that because I don't think I said it enough in the video, that just because this book wasn't for me, it doesn't mean it wasn't for other people. I think maybe I'm just not the target audience for it. And if you are the target audience for it and you do have all that knowledge, then fantastic. Obviously there's other problems with it, which I'm going to go on and talk about in a bit. But in terms of the exclusionary comments from me, is that's just how it made me, and probably a subcategory of people who read this book that don't have the knowledge to appreciate it, feel. And so obviously if this book is completely up your street with all that knowledge, you would definitely get something cool out of it, and I can really appreciate that. So I just wanted to say that as well, because I think it probably wasn't fair to be this book's going to exclude everyone, even though it probably wouldn't, because if you do have that in-depth knowledge, then you're going to be damn, this is cool, probably. I don't know, I can't speak on behalf of those people, but I just pop in and say that. Okay, bye.
This book relies so much more on understanding not even just pop culture, but of very specific elements of pop culture. I know I'm going to preface this by saying that I may end up saying spoilers for these books, so if you don't want to know spoilers, I'm going to try and keep it as spoiler-free as possible, but I don't trust myself, so if you're worried about big spoilers, I'm going to try and avoid big spoilers, but there may be the odd slip up here and there, so just as a warning. But I just this book really specifically, it jumped around from the first ever video game that featured a female lead or protagonist, which was, I think, a Japanese video game that was released, and it didn't have much fanfare about it and actually got really released with a male character, I think, if I'm remembering that correctly. You sort of needed this intricate knowledge of that, and then intricate knowledge of not only Lord of the Rings, but Middle-earth knowledge that's not even in the Lord of the Rings series. It's the extra stuff that was released, that was unreleased even, sorry, that was the non-published stuff, or I don't know, I don't know that much about Lord of the Rings. It's not a franchise I've ever particularly delved into. I've read The Hobbit, but I've never read any of the other books. They are on my list to read, and I have watched the Lord of the Rings films, but not for a very long time. So it's not something I know masses about. I knew enough that if there was light references to it, or references to some of the characters, or the areas, or the places that are there, I'd be able to follow along, but I didn't know any of the other stuff, and I felt as a reader I was being a bit excluded in a way that I was just trusting that anything the characters were saying and talking about was fact, or was part of these worlds, but I was not involved, I felt a bit out of my depth. I didn't understand a lot of the words they were saying. I mean, I can completely see why people might really appreciate this book if they do have this wide knowledge. There's a whole section of this book about a world dedicated to Prince. I know Prince's music, I know some of the culture and pop culture around him. I don't know the ins and outs of his life and his entire discography and all of this other stuff that maybe someone that did know that would get so much out of the area of this book that was dedicated to Prince. I don't know. I also think that from what I was looking up on Goodreads, and I was reading some other reviews for it, this book, and I think Ready Player One actually came under a little bit of fire for having some issues in terms of sort of gender issues, or maybe there was areas that people found were transphobic, which I think maybe Ready Player Two tried to overcompensate for that. There was sort of an emphasis on the fact that you could use these sort of AI headsets to copulate or have sex with lots of other people, and there was sort of gender became too fluid that no one ever really assigned gender anymore. There was a section on it, I don't want to go too much into it because that could have a whole video on itself, but that's just something to note in that has come under quite a bit of criticism. For me, I was oh, that seems a bit overcompensated. Just something to note. I also just think the writing was really sloppy. I felt the writing style was sloppy and just not very enjoyable and not creative, and that was really disappointing for me. So I would give this book maybe a 2 out of 5. 1 out of 5, I don't know. Are we doing ratings? I'll do ratings because it's quite fun. On to the next book that I didn't like. Now this is controversial because everyone in the planet seemed to love this book and the subsequent TV series, and that is Normal People by Sally Rooney. It took me a long time to actually pick this up and decide to read it because I think it was the TV show had come out and people were talking about it online, and I actually still haven't watched the TV show, so I can't speak to that. I saw a few clips here and there that people had reposted or whatever, but I can't speak to the quality of the TV show or the truthfulness of the adaptation adaptation because I didn't watch it. But I was interested to read this because it'd come under a lot of praise. Now, this is going to sound really stupid, but I hate books. Well, no, I did. I was going to say I hate books with conflict. That's not true at all. I find sometimes, and a big reason why I struggle to read or consume TV shows or any kind of media really, if I know there's going to be big conflict and repetitive conflict and things that are going to stress me out, I don't want to read it, because the world is so full of chaos and stress at the moment that for me, the where I'm being drawn to is a world of either fantasy or, you know, low conflict dramas. And that may sound really silly and really like, well then what's the point? Like, why are you reading these books? But for me, that's just where my headspace was at, particularly when I started to read this. So the second I started this, I was like, oh, Jesus Christ, this is just drama after unnecessary drama. It's like, I really like the Back to the Future films, but I can't watch them 99% of the time because the peril that's happening and the, oh, if you do this slight thing wrong, this is going to have a knock-on effect of this. Or it's like the trope of two people are looking for each other, and just as one passes the road and they disappear off, the other one comes out, and if they'd just been a split second earlier, they would have seen each other and all the conflict would have been resolved. I can't deal with it. It's too much. It causes me anxiety. It causes me stress. I get why it's there as like a creative device or a, you know, narrative device, but it prangs me out to the highest level. That's one issue I had with this book, because there was just so much miscommunication between the characters, and I completely get that that's the point. I can really see why people liked this. However, something I also found not in the same category as Ready Player 2, but I felt like this book was a little bit exclusionary as well in terms of the language.
Actually, Laura, maybe you are just not smart enough with these books. Did you ever consider that, you silly sausage?
I'm struggling to like sort of categorize my thoughts in this one, but I found it a little bit pretentious. All of the talking about classical literature or you know, big thinkers and politics. I felt like I know a fair amount about politics and the literature that they talked about, but not everything. And even I felt a bit like, oh, come on. Like, I didn't like any of the characters. I found every single character annoying and pretentious, and that made it really hard to care about the story as a whole, because I had no one to root for. I felt like everyone was just a dick, and I didn't feel like I wanted anyone to win or anyone to succeed. And so that was really difficult to get through, because although the book made me feel things and feel emotions and, you know, connection at various points, because everyone was so unlikable, it made it really, really hard for me to care enough about anything, which I mean, you know, that's just my opinion, and I can definitely see why people did like it, but for me, it just felt like a bunch of pretentious teenagers glamorizing various illnesses and glamorizing abuse, and to me, that ain't it. And I didn't enjoy it. I really didn't, and I think that's a shame. I know she's just released a new book, Sally Rooney, and I don't know anything about it, and I would definitely be interested to see more of her writing, because I did like her writing style, but I did feel like it relied heavily on sort of being smart when it's not always the best thing to be smart in your writing. Obviously you want to be smart in your writing, but you don't want to rely on smartness. That don't make any sense. I hope you got the gist. I'm going to give this a 2 or 3 out of 5. I know my ratings have been here, there and everywhere. 2 or 3. I thought it's good if it's your thing. It just wasn't my thing. Okay, I had to take a break to charge my camera because I didn't do that prior to recording. So the last book in the not so great pile, this kind of isn't awful. I have just mixed opinions on it, and that's why I've categorized it as one of the worst books rather than one of the best. But that is Stoner by John Williams. This is obviously like a classic book. It's renowned, it's widely critically acclaimed. It's not the kind of book I would have naturally picked up to read. However, so my boyfriend gets this thing where like every month he gets sent like a new book, and it's just he put down like all of the things that he likes to read, and they just send him something of that. And I think this was one of the books he got sent, and then because we weren't living together at the time, one of the other books in my good pile is also of the reason I read it was for the same reason, is he got sent it and we thought it'd be cool to read the same book together so then we could talk about it, because obviously for the first few months of lockdown we weren't living together and we didn't see each other for quite a long time, and it was just nice to have something to talk about and discuss like on Zoom and stuff. So that was why I read this. It's not naturally something I would have picked up, and considering that I did enjoy parts of it. Stoner is excellently written. The writing style, the language is wonderful. For me, the story is just not something I would have picked up. Now you're probably thinking, but Laura, like there's very little conflict really in this book. There's very little, you know, it's not dramatic, and the whole point of this book is that it just follows a very average man's life until his very average death, and that's it. And you may be thinking, but like that's exactly what you said you like to read, and yes, to an extent, but for me, because it's obviously of a different time period and it's of a life that's so far removed from anything I've ever experienced, I found the draggingness of it a little bit dull. Having said that, there were definitely parts of it that would have made it one of the best books I read last year, and then there's parts of it that would have made it one of the worst. So I don't want to put it, the more I think about it, I don't want to put it in the worst book, and it's kind of seeping more into one of the better books I read in the year, but I do have quite a big pile of books that I really, really enjoyed. So that's why this sits in the middle. I'm going to categorise this as in the middle. I really liked the style of it. It felt very nice to read, and given something of the time period and of the style, it could have been a hard read, but it wasn't. It was quite an easy read, I felt. What I would say is it made me very frustrated, and maybe that's part of why I didn't enjoy reading the book, because actually in terms of enjoyment, there's nothing to enjoy really about the story. It's an average guy, doesn't achieve much. He goes through quite an awful situation really with his sort of wife. There's no love in his relationship. You know, he has a child and the only good thing about his life is the child, and etc, etc. And it ends just in a not very nice way, and the only good things he has in his life are taken away from him. So it's not enjoyable because there is nothing really good to be rooting, well, there's stuff to be rooting for, but there's nothing good that comes out of the end of the book. Like, it's just a man living his life in a way that life's lived. So that's that really. If that's a book that you're interested in, if you're interested in really sort of naturalistic stories and very real and very truthful sounding stories from a different time period that explore sort of the socioeconomic standards and qualities of life of the time, then I think this is a great book. And if you're looking for something that's excellently written with some wonderful standout lines, imagery of, like, you know, what was happening, fantastic, really well written. Story just wasn't personally up my alley. So yeah, that kind of sits in the middle for me. Not fair to categorise it as one of the worst books, but definitely not one of the best books I read. So now we're into the part where I'm really excited to talk about, even though I've gone on for a very long time already, and that's the books that I absolutely loved that I read last year. I'm going to start with this one actually. I'm going to start with Norwegian Wood. Now this is by Haruki Murakami. This is an excellent book. Obviously it's a translation, and I think it's a fantastic translation because it reads so smoothly, so beautifully. I think sometimes when I've read translations in the past, I feel like it's a shame because I almost just wish I could read it in its original language because sometimes they feel a little bit clunky, but this was just really wonderful. It felt so smooth and the language was lovely, and I just really adored it. It was a book that I would never have normally picked up. It was very widely critically acclaimed and people very much enjoyed it, had great reviews. So maybe a further along down the line, if I was really sort of like browsing through sort of like review sites or Waterstones or somewhere, I would have picked it up. But this I got again because Joe had been sent it and we decided to read it at the same time. And actually I think Joe finished it and then I read it because it's now one of Joe's favourite books. He absolutely adored it. But see, this is a very heavy book. It's emotionally incredibly draining. Just like as a trigger warning, I'm going to talk about a little bit about suicide and stuff in the next sort of 5 minutes when I talk about this book because it does feature heavily. It's really interesting because obviously it's about and around a culture that is so far removed from like how I've grown up in in England. It's a completely different world, a completely different culture, and that's super fascinating and really interesting. And I'm really happy that I read this book because it's outside of what I usually would have read, outside of the comfort zone of that. But what I got out of it was fantastic. Very, I think, unique and heartbreaking and sad story. But that was fantastic. It was just super insightful. There's so many layers to it, so many good things about this book. In fact, I can't really think of anything negative about it. What I would say it's heavy. It's a hard read in terms of your emotional capacity. I tend to I had a massive book hangover after I finished this just because the subject matter is so sad. There are, I think, I want to say off the top of my head 5 suicides in this book. It could be a bit less, it could be a bit more, but there's a lot. And so that's just something to be wary of if that's something you don't want to read about. This is not the book for you, but it was just fantastic. And I love the title of this book, Norwegian Wood, and it sort of touches on the Beatles song. Norwegian Wood is one of Joe's favourite songs, and actually for Christmas this year I had him made one of those, it's like glass plaques that look like an Apple Music, like when you're playing a song, they're all over TikTok. I had that with Norwegian Wood, but then the book cover put on it, so it was like the Beatles song playing, but Norwegian Wood, the book cover on it, which I thought was quite cool. So I'm very proud of thinking of that one. I think it's a fantastic book, would highly recommend it. I thought it was just an absolutely amazing book. It's just really full of a lot of love, it's full of a lot of conflict and sort of emotional issues and inner turmoil, and you get to see into these fantastic, really complex characters. Every single character you meet has a lot of depth to them, and that's something that I just thought was really wonderful, and the characters completely drove the story, and so I would highly recommend this. I'd give it a 4 out of 5 stars. I think I'm trying to be less easy breezy with my 5 stars because like my Goodreads and stuff, like, and on Letterboxd with films, I just give 5 stars to everything because anything I enjoy, I'm like, wow, that was fantastic. But yeah, I'd say 4.5 maybe. I'd probably shy away from the 5 stars just because it's very rare that I find a book that I wouldn't want to read again, and I feel like I wouldn't want to read this again just because, like I say, very heavy subject matter. It would massively depend on like where I am feeling mentally if I'm able to read it, and also I feel like I got so much out of it the first time that it was a really good reading experience, quite a magical reading experience, and I feel like reading it again might ruin some of that for me. So that's why I would give it a 4.5 out of 5. To the next book, which I absolutely adored, and that is Mythos by Stephen Fry. I've currently just started listening to Heroes, the audiobook. Now, I actually ended up reading this in the audiobook form. I bought this near the start of the first lockdown, and I didn't get round to reading it because, like I said, I was really struggling to focus and just read something physically. I downloaded Audible, and obviously when you first get Audible, this is not sponsored, I wish it was, when you first download Audible you get like the 2 free credits, so I was like, you know what, I'm gonna get Mythos. Listening to it was fantastic. Stephen Fry has just such a wonderful voice for audiobooks, and his writing style is just absolutely immaculate. Everything he says feels so perfectly constructed, and it's to the point but still feels artistic, and he is so eloquent with everything he says that I could listen to anything. I'm actually also listening to right now, as well as listening to Heroes, I'm listening to The Ode Less Travelled, which is another Stephen Fry book. I can't get enough of his writing. I think it's fantastic. Now, I've always loved Greek gods and, ancient history. I studied classics and ancient history at A-level, and if, one day I have lots of spare money and spare time, I'd love to get a classics degree in the future, because that's kind of what I toyed with doing before I went on did musical theatre, major regrets now, but there we go. I love this. If you've never heard of, everyone's heard of like Greek mythology and the gods and stuff, but if you don't know the ins and outs of any of the stories, or if you are really well versed in the stories, this book is perfect for any of those people because it tells the stories in a way that feels contemporary but doesn't mess around with the timeline. He's not setting it in the modern world. It's still set in the right time period and everything, and he explains the language of the time really well. But the stories feel up to date. They're told in a language that's completely accessible but still really articulate and wonderful. I just love that. This covers everything from right at the beginning, the Titans through to the gods, and then as you then go on to the second book, Heroes, that then talks about sort of the next generation beyond that of heroes. It's funny, it's full of life, it's never boring, and it's never overcomplicated. Sometimes I found studying classics, I find that sometimes it's really overwhelming because there's so many names for things and it feels like there's so much to remember and you have to know so much, but this book was really accessible, and that's what I thought was wonderful about it. One of the things I absolutely adore is that at the end of each of the stories, he'll sort of summarise how that story, or how a word from that story, or an action from that story has found its way into our lives today, whether that be the etymology of a certain word, or the sort of a place that's named after a thing, or something that we still do or use because of that story, or an ideology we still think of because of that story. And that was... I just got chills at the end of each chapter whenever he discussed how, that's really progressed into our culture and civilization today, and I loved that. I thought it was fantastic. I can't recommend this enough, and I would definitely give this 5 out of 5 stars, Mythos. If you can listen to it on audiobook, would highly recommend, because it's a wonderful thing to listen to as you're walking around or, doing other things, because the stories are really easy to follow and his voice is just, lovely, very nice to listen to. So these are the last 2 books I'm going to talk about today, and they kind of come as a pair, and these are An Absolutely Remarkable Thing by Hank Green and A Beautifully Foolish Endeavour, also by Hank Green. See, this is not a new book. I read this when it first came out, but I ended up rereading it this year so I would be fully prepared for the release of the sequel. Now, I loved An Absolutely Remarkable Thing when I first read it. When I was younger, I was a big John Green fan. I still absolutely love John and Hank Green's, Crash Course, and John Green's podcast, The Anthropocene Reviewed, which I know is on a hiatus at the moment because of the Anthropocene Reviewed book is coming out, which I'm very excited for. But you can say what you want about John Green's writing or his stories or whatever. I know there's issues or that he's faced a lot of criticism in recent years, but his essay writing skills and his sort of modern day analysis of everything, obviously the Anthropocene, as his podcast would suggest, is fantastic. He has such a distinct writing style and a voice that I absolutely love to listen to, and so that's why I love his books. So I was thrilled when then Hank decided, or released, that he was going to be doing books, because I thought that was I don't know, I was really interested to see if he would have the same sort of flair for writing as John, because they're both really smart guys, and obviously I really like their content. So I didn't really know what to expect going into An Absolutely Remarkable Thing when I first read it, but it just gave me everything I could have wanted from a book by Hank Green. You know, it's sci-fi, but also about modern day and social media, and you know, it's got a really strong lead character. Fantastic. So I reread it this year in preparation for A Beautifully Foolish Endeavour, which came out earlier this year, and this was a really excellent sequel. I felt like it carried on the story in a way that didn't feel like it was dragging out for the sake of it. I did feel like everything was planned leading up to that point. Sometimes I feel like with sequels, particularly of books that do really well, because I think An Absolutely Remarkable Thing did do really well in its own right, and so sometimes books that do really well, they're kind of like, oh, okay, so I'm going to do a sequel just because I know it will sell. This didn't feel like that at all. It felt like there was, parts of this that felt like they'd sort of seeped into this in a way that it was pre-planned. What I will say is I found so many similarities with this book and Ready Player 2. So they're really interesting books to have read at a similar time, well, in the same year, because as I read this book, I was reminded drastically of this book, but it pointed out how well this book had done things versus how poorly this book had done things. To explain that, they have very similar subject matter in that it's about AI technology and electronic headsets and sort of this video game world almost, and how by utilising by putting this thing on, it sort of uploads your brain and uploads experiences, and you can do all of these different things through those experiences, and it basically puts the whole world online. Obviously that's going to be a subject that's going to be discussed in a lot of fiction at the moment, because we're moving towards a more AI-led future anyway, so obviously that's going to be on people's minds, particularly if you're science orientated or you spend a lot of time thinking about or immersing yourself in the technological world. It makes total sense for both of these books to be about that thing. However, this book does it in a way that is accessible if you don't know much about technology. There were definitely parts of this book where I was like, man, I have no idea what's going on. Like when it came to sort of like talking about coding or computers and stuff, I'm not technologically minded. However, they were few and far between, and they still didn't make me feel incredibly excluded in the way that like this book did. To this book's credit, it did everything I would want it to do in a subject matter that has the ability to use a lot of jargon and stuff that might exclude readers. What I loved about this book is it did sort of switch around point of views quite a lot, which is something I think has kind of fallen out of trend a bit in recent years. Maybe that's just me and the content I've been consuming, but books, I don't know, everything I've been reading recently has sort of fallen out of trend of doing switching POVs, and I thought this book did it really, really well. It wasn't confusing, it served to push the plot forward, overall just did a really good job, and I thought this was just an excellent sequel. Also, can we talk about the cover art and the design? Absolutely flawlessly designed. They work beautifully as a set, and I just think major props to the designer or team that worked on this, because they are really gorgeous looking books, and I've got both of these signed by Hank Green as well, which because I do keep up to date with sort of when this stuff's been released, so I was thrilled about that. These books just look wonderful, and I've got lovely Hank Green signature there, which I was thrilled about. To wrap up, because my camera's gonna die, those were sort of the best and worst, and I guess that one in between books of 2020. As I said, I think I'm on to my fourth book of 2021, and I'm gonna do a video about my like to be read pile for 2021, I think, in the future, if that's something you're interested in. And I really hope you found this video, sort of my introduction to doing a bit more book content, interesting as well, because it's something I really love to talk about, and I don't really talk about it that much today in my sort of day-to-day life, but it really good to have that conversation with you guys and to get book recommendations, because I really want to branch out and read a lot more this year. Like I said, my goal is 30, and I would love to smash that and go beyond that. I hope you guys have enjoyed this video, and please leave me any video recommendations in the comments, any book recommendations for this year, and I hope to see you guys in the next one. Goodbye.